I'm Dan Edmonds, and this is something we've all been waiting for. It's the new Toyota Land Cruiser. Now, it's a 250 series, not a 300 series, and that's got everybody up in arms. But what I'm going to do is put it up on some jack stands and have a look at its suspension and see what it's really made of. And then, after that, I'm going to put it on my ramp and see how well its suspension articulates. Before I take the tire all the way off, it's worth noticing that they've opened up the room here between the tire and the body mount. So the body mount chop is kind of a thing of the past with a newer generation of Toyotas. This is a 33-inch tire, and we've got enough daylight. I don't know if you'd go to a 35 on here, but I have to run the steering through its arc, but we certainly don't have the problem we had with the last generation Tacoma and 4Runner. Well, this is it. This is the front suspension of the new Land Cruiser. And it's pretty familiar, really. We've got upper and lower control arms, dual wishbones. They're both steel. This one's kind of stamped steel, and this is a weldment. The knuckle here is aluminum, and this ball joint position is not the real high mount position that we see sometimes above the tire. This is kind of right behind the top of the tire, which allows bigger tires to be fit without getting in the way of that. Anyway, let's get in closer. So here is the coil-over shock absorber. It's a Tokiko. This is just a passive shock. There's no adaptive features to it at all. And of course, the upper control arm pivot axis is reclined towards the back, and that introduces resistance to brake dive. Doesn't eliminate it, but it does reduce it. Unlike the Tacoma, the Land Cruiser has a physical bump stop that's external to the shock absorber. This one bolts to the frame here with these bolts and touches the control arm down here. Interestingly enough, it looks like this can be swapped out for another unit, which might give the aftermarket some freedom to play around. The coil-over shock mounts to the lower control arm here in single shear. It necks down here so it can miss the axle and the boot, as a lot of Toyota ones do. It's a Tokiko, as we can see here, and it's a twin tube shock absorber, passive, no adaptive, no external reservoirs, pretty simple. So if you decide to change your shocks, you're not going to be throwing anything away that was really high value. All right, so here is that single shear coilover mount here. And here are the pivot points, which are eccentric cams, so that you can adjust caster and camber by moving them carefully in concert with one another. But what we want to look at is the motion ratio. So the ball joint is in here. This is the bottom bolt. Actual ball joint's a little bit further inboard from where we see the bolt here. Of course, this is the coilover mount, and this is the pivot. So if I had to guess, I'm looking at about a 0.7, maybe 0.75 motion ratio for the coilover. Looking at this control arm a little closer, it's actually more complex than I thought. I mean, we can see the two stamped pieces that are welded together along the seam, but they're both welded to this. It looks like a forged piece, and there's a big bunch of welding right here. So this is really thoughtfully designed, and that allows them to neck this down and get the strength they need, but also provide the clearance as well. And then the arm is just really beefy in here. Nothing really out of the ordinary about the steering stops. You can see there's a notch here in this piece of the well, it's really the knuckle, but it's bolted to the knuckle, but it's technically still an extension of the knuckle. And it's steel, so that it will, when it rubs against this, you're not going to rub into aluminum. So that's interesting. And there's one for full left lock and one for full right lock. And there's redundancy because the same pair on the other side of the truck. We talked about single shear with the coilover mount on the front of the lower control arm. This is double shear. So you can see that the bracket, that this bolt for the stabilizer link, the one that connects it to the lower arm, has flanges on both sides. And so the bolt goes through two pieces of metal on either side of this. So that's double shear. The actual motion ratio, though, is not really, this isn't the best angle to look at it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So here is the outer ball joint right here. Here is the inner pivot, this bolt here. And of course, the center of this, even though this is angled relative to the straight head on the truck, the center is about here, and that's what I have to look at. So it looks like it's about 0.55 to 1, a little over 50%, a little better than 50%. That seems to be the motion ratio. Here is the Land Cruiser's front anti-roll bar, and it's pretty beefy, but there is a disconnect mechanism on the first edition and the Land Cruiser grade. The disconnect does not come with 1958, which is the low buck model. This here is the stabilizer bar disconnect mechanism. We're seeing the bushing here that we saw in the previous shot. The bar goes in here. It's broken into two pieces that join together inside this mechanism. And when you press a button, the connection is broken and the stabilizer bar becomes ineffective. And that increases articulation because it basically makes it like the stabilizer bar isn't even there. And then when you get over a certain speed, it'll automatically reconnect because it's dangerous to drive around all the time with your front stabilizer bar disconnected. But at low speeds, it's fine. The brakes are very similar to the Tacoma. They're 4-piston fixed calipers. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where all the pistons are. A ventilated rotor and open windows. So these are really easy to service at home. This little retainer comes off and these two pins come out, and you can pop the pads right out and put in new ones. If you have to take the rotor off, well, then you have to remove the caliper with 2 bolts at the back, but you don't have to break any brake lines and have any fluid leaks to do that. Well, that's about it for this look at the front suspension of the Toyota Land Cruiser. I'm going to put on the wheel and tire, move to the rear, and see what's going on back there. So this is it. It's the Land Cruiser's new rear suspension. And yeah, it's pretty similar to the previous one, except, you know, the TNGA, that's Toyota Next Generation Architecture, frame has slightly different hard points for some of the links. But we still have 4 links. We have the lower trailing link here. The upper trailing link is back in there behind the spring. We'll look at that later. This is the bottom of the spring right here, sitting on top of the axle. We have a shock absorber here and the bump stop right here, which lands right there on the top of the axle tube. Let's look at all this a little closer up. So yeah, this is the shock absorber. You can see there's a little doubler plate here just to prevent gravel and other debris from, you know, tearing it up too much down here where it's exposed. They're not inverted because you can't invert a twin tube. That's only something you can do with a monotube. So they're pretty much standard shock absorbers. Something that if you decided to replace them, you wouldn't feel bad about trashing them. We have the bump stop, which is hard rubber and shaped so that it contacts this progressively, although it's not going to be as progressive as a urethane stop because hard rubber is hard, hence the name. Anyway, it touches somewhere in here. like all coil-sprung solid rear axles. 4 trailing links locate the axle fore and aft, and basically also combat wind up and brake torque and acceleration torque, all of that with 4 links. And the 2 lower ones are this one here and the other on the opposite side. The upper links are buried higher up. We'll have to get the camera somewhere close to them. So this is one of the upper links. It's the one here on the driver's side. You can see the bolt here, and it disappears back behind the coil spring here, but there's the rear bolt. So yeah, upper link tucked away inside the coil spring. Typical Toyota fashion. So like a lot of coil-sprung solid axles, there's a rear stabilizer bar here. There's the bushing, and the bar itself comes around to here, and then we can see the linkage attaching to this bracket on the frame. So yeah, rear stabilizer bar on the Land Cruiser, but no disconnect. It just goes over the top of the rear axle to another bushing on this side and the other side of the frame. All right, so this is the lateral link, the Panhard bar, the track rod, the 5th link. The 4 trailing links keep things from twisting around and moving fore and aft, but this keeps the whole thing from shifting left and right. And you can see this link on this end has a big bracket that's welded to the frame. And then this spans the length of the vehicle, so it can be, the width of the vehicle, I should say, so it can be as long as possible. And then way over there is a bracket that's welded to the axle, and that's where the other end of this bolts. So this prevents the axle from moving left and right. Now, there's a little bit of asymmetry because it's bolted to the frame on the left and the axle on the right, so when you go through body roll, it won't be 100% the same. And because this swings through an arc, there will be very slight amount of left-right translation, but this is a pretty long bar. It's important that when you have the load on the vehicle that this be level. If it's at an angle, then you're going to have some weird asymmetry, and this one is level. Right now, you know, I've got it jacked up with the wheel off, but it still shows to be pretty level. Pretty standard stuff back here. We have a single piston sliding caliper. The piston's right in here. You can kind of see this. These fingers are kind of opposite where the piston is. Of course, it squeezes from one side, but that pulls the caliper this way so that both pads compress equally. And these are the pins on which it's allowed to slide in order to do that. So this frame is bolted directly to the axle, but this piece is allowed to move slightly. And that's how a sliding caliper can have one piston on one side, but grasp both sides of the rotor at the same time. It's kind of like how your hand would do it if you were doing it like that. You're squeezing with your fingers, but you can squeeze both sides. The tires on this Land Cruiser First Edition are Michelin LTX Trail. They're 265 70/18, which works out to 33 inches tall. Now, these are 18 by 7.5 inch rims. But it's interesting, at the drive event, I could have sworn I saw Toyo Open Country AT3s on another cruiser. So maybe they have 2 suppliers. Maybe that was the wrong tire. I don't know. But this is definitely the tire that I've got on this truck. So what does one of these Michelin LTX Trails weigh? A 33-inch tire on an 18-inch rim? Well, let's see. 65 pounds even. That's quite a bit less than I expected. I might have guessed 10 pounds more than that. Well, I'm running out of daylight. It sounds like the parrots want to get busy. So I'm going to put this wheel back on and get this thing buttoned up and be ready to put it on my ramp tomorrow when I have more light and less parrots. Well, we've got our daylight back. The parrots are off somewhere else. Here's my 20-degree ramp and the Land Cruiser, of course. I'm going to drive it up twice once with the bar connected, another time with the bar disconnected, and we'll see what it can do. So one of the things that everybody is asking me is, what's the difference between this Land Cruiser and the new GX550, since they're both 250 series based and they share pretty much the same chassis. They have different engines and they look a little different. And one of the places where that look is pretty functional is right up here. The Land Cruiser has several degrees better approach angle than the GX. And you can see here on the ramp, there's this little piece here, but it's obviously something I could remove if I wanted to improve the local approach angle right in front of the tire. And frankly, I would probably do that if I owned one of these. But I don't need to take it off to go up the ramp because we're golden. So like all Land Cruisers, for as long as I can remember, there was probably a time when this wasn't true, but full-time four-wheel drive, so I don't need to engage four-wheel drive. I just drive up. There's a center differential I can lock, a rear differential I can lock. I probably won't need to, but if I do, it's just a button press. So let's see what happens. Oh, that's too far. I can feel it rocking. About there. I think I may have backed up too much. Yeah, it's still pretty heavily weighted. So I'm going to futz around and get it at the right spot, but I'm not going to waste a lot of footage doing that. So I'll see you on the other side when I've got it right. I had to be a little careful though, because while I was doing this, I remembered that yesterday when I weighed it on some scales, I found that this has 50-50 weight distribution. Actually, it's like 49.8, 50.2 here, because the hybrid battery's back here under the cargo floor. So I thought, well, maybe the front's lifting, but for whatever reason, because of the ramp or whatever, the rear is the thing that's lifting first. And I'm right at that point. Sandpaper in, sandpaper out. So this is the measuring point. Well, it's time to measure the first run. That looks to be the spot. (21 1/16). All right, so 21 1/16 is 21.06. So we're going to divide that by the sine of 20, and we get 61.58. Now, I've got it memorized. This is 112.2 inch wheelbase. So we'll divide that number by 112.2 and multiply by 1,000. And we have a pretty healthy 549 with the bar connected, I should say. So we're going to be better than that. This is looking very promising. This is pretty good. I mean, over 50% of the vehicle's wheelbase is up on the ramp, 549. Anything over 500 basically means that. So this is pretty promising because we haven't unlocked the front bar yet. And I know that my own 4Runner with KDSS did a little better than this, but not substantially better than this. So yeah, maybe the Land Cruiser can cruise some land. Let's unlock the stabilized bar and see what it can do then. So if this thing is anything like the TRD Off-Road Tacoma we tested a little while ago, I won't be able to unlock the stabilizer bar while it's loaded and twisted up like this. But you know what? I think that's okay, because if you are able to do that, when the bar suddenly releases, the vehicle's weight can shift pretty quickly, and you might not want that to happen depending on the circumstances. So it's actually better, in my mind, to unlock the stabilizer bar before you get in trouble, or if you get in trouble and you want to go further, back up, unlock it, and try again. And that's pretty much what I think I'm going to have to do here. I have a feeling that last little lunge did the trick, but let's find out. Won't go in. Lift up a little bit. Won't quite come out. We're there. Awesome. I think I'm going to like this number. Well, things look a lot different now that I've unlocked the bar. You can see we've climbed up a considerable distance. Also, the tire is stuffed in the wheel well now, where it wasn't before. I mean, if you put a bigger tire in here, it might still clear, but you know, this 33, it's stuffed up in there more than it was with a stabilizer bar connected. And then this piece right here, I mean, I can't quite get my finger through here, but it's about 1 centimeter away, a 1/4 inch actually. And yeah, this piece, I think this would go like in the first hours I owned the vehicle. All right, time to tape it up and make the measurement. That's the spot right there. And tape goes right here. Now, just looking at this, it looks like we're just over 9 inches further up the ramp. Let's see what the math says, but this drywall square from 0 to, well, just about 9 1/4. What does this mean in terms of wheel lift? It's just shy of 24 1/4, so I'm going to call it 24 7/32, which is going to drive you metric people nuts. Well, I can't do 7/32 in my head, so I'll just use the calculator. So that's 24.22. So that is the wheel lift here. And we'll divide that by the sine of 20 and get 70.81 inches of climb. Of course, 112.2 is still the wheelbase, but you know, that's over 9 inches, like we said, 9 1/4 more than with the bar connected. So divide that by 1112.2 and multiply that by 1,000. And I get 631. 631 is a flex index of the new Land Cruiser with the bar disconnected. Now that's, you know, 85 or more, almost 90 points better. I can't do the math that quickly in my head, but it's a lot. All right, so what I've got here is a bunch of measurements I've made in the past, and these are vehicles I think are relevant to this new Land Cruiser. And of course, right at the top is the old Land Cruiser, the 200 series with KDSS 661. LX600, which is really a 300 series Land Cruiser in Lexus clothing with a nose that doesn't have great approach clearance, but it flexes to the tune of 630. Of course, this is a previous generation, or current generation, I should say, until the new one comes out, officially. So this is a 4Runner with KDSS. It's mine. 563, and this has front and rear stabilizer bars that disconnect kind of automatically in response to terrain. Bronco, 4-door, first edition, front stabilizer bar disconnect, 560. Rivian R1S has a really cool hydraulic roll control system that isn't really stabilizer bars, but you can program them in certain modes to just release and give you all the articulation. So it's like it has no stabilizer bars, and that's 555. Of course, last generation, or I guess current generation, TRD Pro 4Runner doesn't have a disconnect. The next one will, 533, and then on down. I put the Tacoma in here because this is the new Tacoma. It has the same stabilizer disconnect this has, and it's 489 with it disconnected. Why is it so different? Well, the pickup truck has about 20 inches more wheelbase than this, something like that. So wheelbase really hurts. As you can see when I do the math, you divide the ramp climb by the wheelbase. Longer wheelbases hurt you there. But they also hurt you out in the wild. So with the bar on, this Land Cruiser, 250 base Land Cruiser, is at 549, which is right in there, pretty close to the current generation 4Runner with disconnectable stabilizer bars. So that's pretty good for stabilizer bars that don't come loose. And remember, this is a shorter wheelbase because I think it's 109.8 or something like that. And it's going to be 112.2. So if everything stayed the same with the 4Runner, and we know it hasn't, it would get a little worse because the wheelbase is going to get longer. So this number wouldn't be as good divided into 112.2, which is what will happen with the new 4Runner. So anyway, not bad, and it's relevant because if you get a 1958, the cheap Land Cruiser, you don't have a stabilizer bar disconnect, but you do have this much flex, which isn't bad. It's not in bad company. But, of course, we can disconnect the stabilizer bar, and we did, and look where this one slots in. Right there, and I find that really interesting. Yeah, the 200 series Land Cruiser is 30 points better, but 30 isn't a ton. This has KDSS, so front and rear stabilizer bars that disconnect. This is just the front. This thing costs about 100 grand. This is about 30 grand less. So, is 30 points worth 30 grand? I don't know. Interestingly enough, we do know what a 300 series will do because the LX600 over at Lexus is a 300 series. And guess what? It's about the same. So is it a bad thing that this isn't a 300 series Land Cruiser and it's a 250? I'm not seeing that. Not here, and not when I look at the price tag. Anyway, that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments.